Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Welcome to the 2023 Michael and Susan Dell Center Lectureship in Child Health. Each year we recognize distinguished researchers and leaders in child health, bringing world-class speakers to the Austin area and beyond each spring. This year, our keynote presentation is taking place via webinar so that we can disseminate it more broadly. I'm Deanna Hoelscher, and I'm director of the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living. I am pleased to welcome you all here today to hear from Dr. Schwartz on school food and its importance in public health nutrition research to guide policymakers. The Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living was founded in 2006 with a vision of healthy children in a healthy world. We advanced health and healthy living for children and families through our cutting-edge research, through community-based programs that are innovative, and then dissemination of evidence-based practices. So our three strategic aims talk about creating new work and training a workforce, connecting with the public health community as well as community partners, and then communicating evidence-based data out. So through our strategic goals and our vision and mission, we've created several resources. And so most of these are available on our website. So feel free to use the QR code to visit our website and see our center resources. In addition to these, we've been preparing several legislative updates and initiatives. And if you use the QR code here, that will direct you there. We will also be sending out a link at the end of this presentation. So before I get started, I'd like to thank Dr. Aliyah Husseini and her team at the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. They have provided generous funding for today's lectureship and for the center, and we really appreciate their support. So I have a few brief housekeeping announcements before we get started. One is this webinar is being recorded and it will be archived along with the presentation slides on our website at msdcenter.org. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them into the question chat box. We will have time for some questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. So for those of you that would like to disseminate any of the information during today's lecture through social media, please use the hashtag MSDLecture. We look forward to seeing your insights on the lecture. We also will be sending out a post-evaluation to all attendees as well as links to today's lecture. And so with that, I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker today from the University of Connecticut, Dr. Marlene Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is the director for the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Health and professor of Human Development and Family Sciences at the University of Connecticut. Her research examines how nutrition and wellness policies implemented in schools, food banks, and local communities can help improve food security, dietary quality, and health outcomes. Dr. Schwartz earned her Ph.D. in psychology from Yale University. Prior to joining the Rudd Center, she served as the co-director of the Yale Center for Eating and Weight Disorders for a decade. She has received research grants to support her work for past 20 years, and this includes funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the National Institutes of Health. We are really honored to have her here today and look forward to her presentation. And listen closely because you'll hear a lot about Dr. Schwartz throughout this presentation. Dr. Schwartz?
Thank you so much for that invitation and introduction, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. So I'd like to start off just sort of explaining how I got from here, sort of as a clinical psychologist, which was my training to here, which is really thinking about policy research. And during the first 10 years of my career, I was doing clinical work with families and children and adolescents that were struggling with eating disorders and excess body weight, and really trying to deliver, empirically validated treatments and help them have as healthy a lives as they could. And particularly as we started seeing more and more families coming in with a child with obesity, I felt like I could help them in my office. I could talk to them about healthy food choices and, and television, limiting television, increasing physical activity. But effectively, they would go out into the world and the world would kind of undo everything that I was trying to accomplish with them as a clinician. And so I started to think that it would really be more effective to try to think about how can we change that environment in order to make it easier for families and easier for parents to raise healthy children. So in 2005, the Rudd Center started. The original founder was Kelly Brownell, and our mission is to promote solutions to food insecurity, poor diet quality, and weight bias through research and policy. And the place that I decided to really start my research was in the school setting. And this was inspired by a client of mine who talked about how hard it was for her to find healthy food at school. And so I started to really look into what is going on in our schools, where is there food at school? And of course, everyone always thinks of the cafeteria, which has, of course, the school lunch, the school breakfast oftentimes, as well as a la carte or sort of competitive foods that are sold outside the school meal program. But there's also food in schools in the hallways and public spaces. You have vending machines, school stores, oftentimes fundraising goes on there. Then in the classrooms, you'll have parties and food used as a reward, sometimes by teachers, as well as other fundraising. And then finally, outside on the school grounds, there can be food sold, particularly at the high school level through booster programs with concessions during, evening events or football games. And so when you talk about changing school food, it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of different places that you need to try to influence. And I learned early on about kind of the structure of the school meal program, which is that it's a federal program, but it's administered through states. And there are 3 tiers of pricing based on the student's household income. And these are the current federal government reimbursement rates, which I will note are substantially higher than they were just a few years ago, where for each child who actually buys the school lunch, so they're called sort of paid kids, the district will get 77 cents. For each child who pays a reduced price, the district will get $3.93. And then for each child who qualifies to get a meal at no cost or a free meal, the district gets $4.33. And there can be a slight increase in this amount by a couple of cents if it's considered a severe need district where more than 60% of the students qualify for free or reduced meals. And in addition to this funding, some states provide additional funds. And historically, when the school meal program was started back in 1946, the problem was undernutrition. So this is just an overview of the key components that were required to be part of a school meal back then. And you can see it's balanced in terms of different food groups. But what's important to also realize is there were minimums in terms of how many calories you needed to provide, but no maximums. And there were also no limits on things like sugar or fat. And this was really developed to make sure that we safeguarded the health and well-being of the nation's children, and in addition to make sure that people were healthy enough to join the military. So competitive foods, which are those foods that are sold outside the school meal program, have an interesting history. There have been a lot of political battles over them for several decades, and there was a fight early on about whether or not USDA had the power to regulate the nutritional quality of those competitive foods. And in 1980, there was a lawsuit from the National Soft Drink Association saying that they didn't think that USDA should be able to regulate those foods outside of the lunch period. And in 1984, the court decided indeed that the National Soft Drink Association won and that USDA couldn't regulate foods. So what that meant was, starting in 1984, foods that were sold in the cafeteria during lunch had to meet some pretty minimal nutrition standards, which are actually called foods of minimal nutritional value. So it really only cut out a handful of foods. And school stores, vending machines, and fundraisers were basically allowed to sell anything, including sugary drinks, before or after lunch. And this led to what came to be known as pouring rights contracts, which are where companies like Coke or Pepsi would come into a school district and have a contract where if you only sold products from their company, then there would be a financial incentive for that. And sometimes it came with, gifts like a scoreboard or something like that. Over time, school lunches changed considerably. They continued to have those minimum protein, grain, fruit, vegetable, and milk, no sugar limits, no calorie limits. But what happened was there started to be a transition to more processed foods, which made sense to save on cost, staff time, and the need for equipment. And you started seeing more and more kids' food, so things like pizza, chicken nuggets, hamburgers, fries, flavored milk. And in a way, school lunches started to look a lot like restaurant kids' meals. So we're talking sort of during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And research started to emerge showing that there were reasons to be concerned about the nutrition in school meals. So these are data from the SINDA studies, which are national studies from the USDA that essentially look across the country at what's being served in schools and evaluating it. And so in 2012, the data that came out showed that elementary school lunches had 115% of the maximum recommended amount of sodium, fat, and added sugars that a child should have in the whole day. And the leading contributors in the 2009 publications were that flavored milk, cookies, cakes, brownies, pizza were the problems in terms of those sodium, fat, and added sugars. And interestingly, one food predicted higher caloric intake and higher body weight among the students. And the food that did that was French fries. So I was learning about all of this and looking at what was happening in the schools and really thought that it would make sense to try to see if there were ways to improve the nutrition. And I met some folks at the Connecticut State Department of Education, where they do oversee the National School Lunch Program in our state, and they were very interested in improving nutrition at this time. So this was in the early 2000s, but they were worried, and they said that they were hearing a lot of pushback from school districts in terms of limiting the competitive foods that they sold. And the big worries were, we will lose money. If you take away soda and chips, students will binge on these foods at home, or students will actually develop eating disorders. Well, I was a little skeptical about that last one in particular, having treated eating disorders and not thinking there was any evidence that what was in the vending machine at school would affect that. But these are empirical questions, and so we set out to study them. So we did what we called the Connecticut Healthy Food Pilot Study, where we had 3 school districts that each had 2 middle schools, where one middle school was the pilot and removed all snacks and beverages that didn't meet state nutrition guidelines back in 2004, 2005. The comparison schools were made the same. The food service directors got a list of approved beverages and snacks, and we waited to see what happened. We assessed diet quality and body image before and after, and we also looked at the finances. So for body image and diet quality, we found that the middle school students in the pilot schools, as expected, consumed more healthy snacks and beverages at school, fewer unhealthy snacks and beverages at school. So that reflected what was available. But importantly, there was no evidence of any compensatory increases in junk food at home. So it wasn't as though somehow if they didn't get potato chips at school, they were going to eat twice as many potato chips at home. We also found, encouragingly, that there was no effect on the condition, intervention versus control, on body image concerns or unhealthy dieting behavior. So this was reassuring and gave us evidence to cite when people express that concern in terms of a reason not to try to pass a state policy. The financial findings were good, but a little more complicated. The pilot schools on average did not lose money when they made these changes, but it isn't quite because the kids just went for all of the healthier a la carte sales or a la carte foods. Basically, those a la carte sales overall did go down, but lunch sales went up. So it was almost as though the students were like, ugh, I don't really want these baked potato chips. I'm just going to go ahead and get the school lunch. And as I explained, because the school lunch tends to come with state and federal reimbursement, you sort of benefit from that as a food service director every time that you are able to serve a lunch. So around this time, my personal and my professional worlds collided. I was studying this, during the day at work, and then my oldest child began elementary school. And sure enough, they sold snack every single day at her elementary school, and it was ice cream, chips, and cookies. And, of course, my first grader wanted to buy a snack every day. We sort of negotiated and decided she could buy snack on Fridays. I was a little annoyed as a parent. I thought of calling the school and complaining, but I decided, this is my oldest child. It was brand new. It was like, September. I didn't want to become that parent right away. Well, in December, though, we got a flyer from the PTO for a cookie eating contest. And that really was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back with me. And I thought, that's ridiculous. Why are we sponsoring something that's really designed to have kids, eat as many cookies as they can? So I decided to get involved, and I called the principal of the high school, and interestingly found that she was really an ally. She actually didn't like all the junk coming into the schools. She, however, was worried that parents would get upset if she were to try to set limits. And I thought to myself, well, of course, if we just explain it to the parents, they'll be totally fine. So we did a survey, because that's what you do when you're trying to find out how people feel about things. And we asked parents lots of questions about how they felt about school meals, how they felt about the other food in school. And here are some of the comments that we got back. I prefer to see only healthy foods offered in public schools. The kids are exposed to lots of junk food and empty calories. Please take the junk out of the schools. This is the most important thing you can do for our children. And then this last one really reminded me of my work as a clinician. My child is overweight. We're trying so hard to make changes at home. The food at school is making things harder for us. So in our district, we created a committee. We decided to create a policy to remove all the competitive foods from the elementary schools, to prohibit food as a reward in the classroom and classroom parties. I have to say, getting rid of the birthday cupcakes was a major, major obstacle, but we really came up with lots of ideas of other ways that kids could celebrate birthdays by going outside, having extra recess, playing games, having the birthday child pick the game, or having the kids make a birthday book where they write, draw a picture and say what's something they like about the child, and the teacher puts it together, or the parents can come in and read a book to the class. So things were going reasonably well in my school district, and I started, kind of going to the cafeteria to see how things were going in terms of the school meals. And one thing that I noticed is that in the National School Lunch Program, you need to have 5 components that you offer: a milk, grain, a meat or meat alternate, a fruit, and a vegetable. And usually the grain and the meat alternate are combined. So it's like macaroni and cheese or pizza or a taco. So that's like the main dish. And what I noticed is that the kids had to take 3 of those 5 components in order for it to be a reimbursable meal. And a lot of kids were taking the milk, and they would take the main dish, and then that was it. And around this time, there was a lot of research coming out about behavioral economics, and if you can sort of put food in front of someone, they're more likely to eat it. Now, we were mostly looking at it in terms of the concerns about the food environment, and there's so much unhealthy food that people are eating because it's so accessible, but maybe it could work the opposite way, that if we could just get the healthy food in front of the kids on their tray when they sat down, maybe they would be more likely to eat it too. So we decided to do a little study where we had a control school and an experimental school. And we had the control school basically leave things the way they are. The kids went through the line, they could take their 3 components, nobody said anything to them about it. And then we just tracked how much did they take of the fruit serving, and it was either 100% juice or fruit. Fresh fruit, both counted as the fruit serving, and those were available every day. So we looked at how many kids actually took it, and then how many actually ate it. So I had observers in the cafeteria who were watching the kids and collected the trays at the end and actually calculated the percentage that was consumed. And so in our control schools, where things were sort of left as they are, you can see about 65% of the kids took of the fruit serving, and of that, about 70% of it got eaten. In the intervention school, what we did is we had the people working in the cafeteria do a verbal prompt where they said, would you like fruit or juice? Now, this is one of those sort of tricky parenting things where you ask a question where it feels like a choice, but implied in the question is you're taking one or the other. And indeed, that's what happened. Most of the kids took one or the other. In fact, most of them took the fruit. We decided if the child said, I don't want either, that was fine. And so it was close to 100%, but not quite there. But then here's the really interesting thing. Of the kids who took it, 70% got eaten. So the actual amount that was consumed, the proportion of it was identical, whether they sort of chose it or they were prompted to take it. And as a result of that policy change, the percentage of children eating fruit went from 33% to 55%. So this was one of the sort of early studies I did to really realize the power of the school meal program to make policy changes like this and have a substantial impact on children's diets. So as many of you may remember, back in the National WIC reauthorization of 2004, there was an effort to there had been this effort to include federal oversight of competitive foods, but this compromise, this kind of political compromise, was to develop something called district wellness policies. And the idea was that you would ensure local control and local attention to the school environment relevant to childhood obesity. And those policies needed to include goals for nutrition education, nutrition standards for all foods in schools, goals for physical activity, and a plan for measuring implementation. And they had to be implemented in the 2006-2007 school year. So I started wondering, how much will these individual policies change the environment? And of concern, will local school wellness policies improve all school districts similarly, or is it possible that it would actually increase disparities across districts? And I was really sort of informed by my own experience, seeing what it was like trying to make changes in my town, and thinking, and how much work it was, and thinking, are all school districts going to have the capacity to really attend to this, and is it going to be a priority, or are we going to end up with some districts that have these healthier environments and others that don't? So this was actually the first grant I ever got from Healthy Eating Research, was to do this study, which was to look at wellness policies in Connecticut. We had baseline data where we knew what the food service directors were selling in terms of competitive foods in the schools. We had a principal survey in terms of the practices that were relevant to the sorts of things that are in wellness policies. And then we did a sort of follow-up assessment with the same people, the same questions, to see how things changed before and after the policies went into effect. And we collected all 151 school policies that are in Connecticut. And we scored them using something called the WellSat, which was actually developed as part of this project, but has since been updated 3 times. And it gave us a quantitative score for the strength and the comprehensiveness of that policy that we could then use to really see how they varied across the state and if there were demographic variables that predicted the strength of them. So the grant actually was to look at macro level variables and the effect on the nutrition environment. So I started thinking about different macro level variables that I thought might affect policy strength. And the first one I thought of was population size. Maybe big cities were going to have more trouble. The other was proportion of children who qualified for free or reduced lunch. It's possible that lower income districts might not be able to make these changes or attend to this as much. But remember, this is still happening in my town. We've made all these changes, and for better or for worse, I was very much associated with them. So I would sometimes get emails from angry parents. And here's some quotes from one of those, where someone was very upset and said, there are so many rules and life seems like less fun nowadays for kids. Even in the Bible, they celebrate with food. And then, this is America, where we continue to fight and die for the basic rights of freedom. If parents and students choose to drink whole milk and eat ice cream, they retain the right to do so. So it wasn't just this email. I was going around to different schools and doing presentations like this kind of for parents, trying to explain the role of the food environment, the concern about childhood obesity, and improving children's nutrition. And I found myself in a meeting where 2 parents literally stood up and started yelling at each other. One of them was saying, you don't have the right to tell me that I can't bring cupcakes into my child's classroom to celebrate his birthday. And the other parent said, you don't have the right to come into my child's classroom and start handing out cupcakes. And I literally sat myself down at that meeting, even though I was presenting, and thought, this is not about cupcakes. This is about something else. And what it's really about is political beliefs and what people believe the role of government is. And so I added this variable in for political landscape, which has proven to, I think, be extremely relevant to this topic. So we essentially quantified that by the proportion of Democrats to Republicans in the town, because the town districts, every town has its own school district, and those district policies are voted on by a board of education, and it is something, you know, they're elected officials. So here's what we found. My population density and proportion of kids who qualify for free reduced lunch, turns out it was a significant predictor, but in the opposite direction. I was 100% wrong in my hypothesis that in fact the big cities and the cities that had a larger proportion of low-income families actually had stronger policies. They took this very seriously. They did a really great job writing these policies, and they tended to really put in a lot of sort of comprehensive and strong language. I was, however, right on the political landscape variable that the proportion of Democrats to Republicans did predict a stronger wellness policy above and beyond the other variables. And that has proven to continue to play out at the state and national level as well. So the other thing we found was that the policy strength mattered. So across our state, the stronger the policy, the better things were looking on the ground. The principals reported, more nutrition education, limits to food at parties, fundraising, better physical activity. That really came through when we looked across. But I also needed to see how did these policies affect the actual food environment. So I was going to look at the sugary drinks that were available in the schools and also the sort of less healthy snacks. Well, when you're doing research, studying policy change, sometimes the policies actually change, not part of your study. And that's exactly what happened to me. In 2006, in Connecticut, we had a very ambitious Senate president who really cared about children's nutrition. And he really worked very hard to get a bill through that did pass that said that we had strong beverage standards, K through 12, milk, water, and 100% juice were the only things you were allowed to sell. At the time that this passed, this was the strongest piece of state legislation in the country. So this, of course, was great news for Connecticut, but this was terrible news for my study because now we would never know what would have happened to the sugary drinks had this bill not passed. So I was sort of lucky, though, and was able to pivot because they didn't have a law about nutrition standards for snacks. What they did instead is they created something called healthy food certification. So this is, the way this works is they use the nutrition standards very much like the ones that we had studied in our pilot, but you got an extra 10 cents per lunch of reimbursement from the state if you signed up to essentially as a district only sell competitive foods that met those standards. And lucky for me, 50% of districts signed up in year one, and lucky for me, there were no significant differences between the groups that signed up and those who didn't on any of my key demographic variables. So what this did is it really permitted me to study this natural experiment of comparing districts that had their own local wellness policy that they had written that had nutrition standards in it, and those that basically signed up to follow the state policy. And so here's what we found. We looked at the percentage of snacks. We gave all the food service directors a list of all these different snacks, and they checked off the ones that they sold. And so the sort of number on the left is the percentage of listed snacks that they said they sold. And we had that before in 2006 and after in 2007. And then in yellow, you can see the districts that were following their local nutrition standards from their own wellness policy, but didn't sign up to follow the state. And then in red, the ones that did. And what you can see is a really clear interaction. Everyone sort of started at the same place. Those that, had their own policies, it got better. It definitely went down. There were definitely snacks they weren't selling anymore, but those who followed the state standards really went down and were virtually not selling any at all anymore. We saw an even more dramatic effect at the middle school level. There was just sort of a tiny decrease for the local policies. And then at the high school level, again, a very clear interaction where there was a lot being sold before. It got fairly better with the local policies, but significantly better if they followed the state law. So just sort of a quick update, this healthy food certification program has remained in effect all of these years, and it became clear that it was working for people. They were getting more funds. They weren't losing money by not selling those snacks. And so you can see every single year it improved over time, the number of districts that participated, and we're now at virtually, it's 95.8, virtually all districts in Connecticut participate in this program. So the financial impact of it, though, was something we were still interested in studying. And this was actually a student project where he looked at lunch participation in districts over 5 years and saw those that participated in this healthy food certification and compared to those who didn't. And what he found was that those districts saw a significant increase in middle and high school lunch participation. So this reflects what we had seen in our pilot study, and that translated into an average of $30,000 of new revenue for each district. So again, this was more evidence that limiting unhealthy competitive foods could improve school food finances. So around this time, there was a lot of activity going on nationally. Different states were passing legislation to improve school meals and competitive foods. And there's actually national data now from USDA that those states that had strong state nutrition policies on competitive foods actually had students that were exposed to fewer unhealthy foods in schools and had lower BMIs. This was a paper that we published a couple years ago using the school nutrition and meal cost study data. But going back, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island all had different state policies, and what was kind of interesting and wasn't planned, but I think helped in the long run, is they weren't exactly the same. So they had slightly different sodium or slightly different sugar limits, and frankly, it was driving the food industry crazy because they were trying to reformulate their snacks in order to be able to sell them in schools, and they couldn't even reformulate them the same way to sell in these, 3 tiny states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So I think that that did help contribute to their openness to talking about some national standards finally for competitive foods. And indeed, that did come along. The 2010 Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act did require USDA to establish new nutrition standards for competitive foods, as well as significantly revise the school meal standards and strengthen the requirements for school wellness policies. So there was a lot of talk about the big changes that were made in the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. And I just put this up so you can see that the actual meal pattern hardly changed at all. The substance of it, the sort of major groups that needed to be represented were effectively the same. The sort of milk needed to be skim or 1%. There was also more requirements around a variety of vegetables. So, basically it couldn't just be potatoes and corn. You needed to really have a lot of different vegetables over the week, much more emphasis on having whole grains, and there was kind of a staged, progression to increase the amount of whole grains, as well as I said, low-fat dairy. And instead of just calorie minimums, we finally had calorie maximums as well that were adjusted by age group. One of the changes, though, sort of going back to the sort of pilot study I had done in my own district, was that students had to take a fruit or a vegetable as one of the 3 components. So that was, I thought, a great policy, but also, as I'll mention, led to some discussion about whether or not that was a good idea. So in 2014, the competitive food standards kicked in. They were called Smart Snacks, and they applied to all foods sold on school property during the school day. So this distinction between the lunch period and not the lunch period went away. It also effectively removed regular soda sports drinks from schools altogether. Diet soda and diet drinks are still allowed in high schools. Interestingly, though, the food industry quickly adapted and made special school versions of a lot of their products. And these are pictures of 3 products that are available in schools that are smart snacks that have been reformulated. And these are pictures of the regular versions of those products that are still sold in stores. And we've studied this at the Rudd Center as part of our food marketing work, and really find it quite concerning that the brands effectively are identical. I mean, everybody can tell exactly what the brands are for the school versions, and yet those are not available outside of schools. So the companies are still marketing their product, they're still marketing their brands, they're sort of getting in there because they've made these changes in those very special products, but you can't get them someplace else. So when kids get used to eating Cheetos at school and then they want Cheetos at home, the Cheetos that they're buying at the store are not as healthy. We also started seeing some targeted political attacks as the school meal standards were kicking in, and people may remember the Thanks Michelle Obama, Twitter thing where students were taking pictures and were tweeting, and it was very concerning and very sort of upsetting for those of us who were excited about the improvements that were being made in schools. So it happened to be that we were in the middle of doing a study in New Haven, a big grant where we were looking at really helping them implement their nutrition education and their other sort of strong nutrition and physical activity policies. And so we had 12 schools that we were following for 3 years, and we had a bunch of measures on these kids, one of which was plate waste. So we had gone into these 12 schools in 2012, 2013, and 2014. We had assessed what they had selected as part of their meal and how much they ate. And it was, again, lucky that this was in the middle of when these policy changes happened. So it's effectively, I had 2012 data before the requirement to take a fruit and a vegetable went into effect, and then 2013 and 2014 data afterwards, as well as the other changes that were required for the school meals. So we measured the proportion of children who selected each food group, and then we collected the trays afterwards, and we actually, with a scale, measured how much was eaten and then calculated the proportion of children who consumed each food group. So let me just walk you through these slides of what we found. So this is the percent of students who selected each of these food groups. So 2012 data are on the left within the yellow, and you can see that there was a significant increase in the proportion of kids who took fruit. There was a decrease the first year in the proportion of kids who took the vegetables. It actually wasn't a significant difference the second year, and it's kind of hard to see on this slide, but the standard deviation was massive. And because it was so big, that actually was not a significant change overall in terms of vegetable selection between 2012 and 2014. The proportion that took the entrees went up significantly, and the proportion that took milk stayed totally flat the whole time. So here's what they ate. The proportion eaten of the fruit was around 70%, no significant difference from 12, 13, or 14. So it sort of stayed right around that level. The proportion that ate the vegetables, however, went up significantly by the end. So it was sort of interesting that kind of fewer kids were taking it, but the kids who were taking it were eating more of it. Entree consumption, despite people saying that kids didn't like the entree, we saw no evidence of that. More kids were taking it and they were eating significantly more of it. And then milk also stayed exactly the same. So we published this study sort of summarizing that fruit consumption overall went up, because if more kids are taking it and they're all eating 70% of it, then the amount that's getting consumed went up, and that there was no increase in total plate waste. This got a fair amount of press. USDA, I think, was really grateful to have some research supporting the changes they had made. It got entered into the congressional record. There are a couple other studies coming out around the same time that found the same thing. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that plate waste is a very big problem in school meals and continues, unfortunately, to be a problem. So this is an infographic from a review paper that I wrote with a colleague, Juliana Cohen, and a number of other co-authors, where we really tried to review the entire literature on school meal consumption and what can help. And so these are just sort of the 7 big findings from that study. One is time, making sure that kids have enough time to eat. The research shows if you have longer lunch period, kids will eat more of their meals. There's actually evidence supporting this idea of rewarding students who try fruits and vegetables. There's emerging evidence that recess before lunch can help. It's not like 100% of the time, but there's enough evidence that it's worth trying. There is evidence that if you adapt the recipes to improve their palatability and cultural appropriateness, that you also see an increase in consumption. Limiting students' access to competitive foods during the school day, again, helps with consumption. Offering students more menu choices is another great strategy. And in fact, in our plate waste study, we also looked at the number of fruit options that were offered each day and found that the more different choices available, the more kids took it. And then finally, super practical, providing pre-sliced fruits and vegetables. So just making it easier, particularly for small children, to eat the food and not have it take too much time. So lots happened in the next administration in terms of school meals. In 2017, there were efforts by USDA to roll back the school nutrition standards, and this was, of course, a concern for public health advocates. And Center for Science in the Public Interest actually sued the Trump administration over this rollback. At that time, my colleagues and I wrote a couple of op-eds for journals. One was in JAND, one was in AJPH, sort of arguing for the benefits of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act and arguing against rolling these back. And in fact, the federal court struck down those rollbacks. So they ended up not happening to the extent that they were threatening. However, a few other things started happening, as we all know, in the 2020. So some of it is from the research. We know that the nutritional quality of school meals is significantly higher than it was before the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, and the dietary quality among those who eat the school lunch has improved. And so I have the sites for those studies here. Another study I thought was amazing that came out is that nationally, when you look at where kids are getting their food and the nutritional quality of the different sources, school meals provide the healthiest food most American children consume all day. And then finally, a research paper came out showing that improvements from the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act are associated with a significant decrease in the risk of obesity among children from families with low income. So really across the board, a lot of evidence emerging on the power of this huge national policy. So COVID-19, in some ways, it was obviously incredibly challenging for food service directors to continue serving meals. But at the same time, I think this was one of our papers that we did, and there have been a lot of papers like this, just showing the remarkable job that food service directors did all over the country, continuing to provide meals for families, even when the buildings were closed. And so I think it's worth really taking a moment to acknowledge that and recognize how much coordination and innovation and frankly dedication was really required in order to keep those meals coming during the very sort of first couple years of the pandemic. And as people also know, there was a policy, that waiver essentially offered, that allowed schools to serve meals at no cost for everyone. Interestingly, around the same time, I was working on another review article with Juliana Cohen to look at the consequences or the sort of benefits of healthy school meals for all, or universal free school meals. And the few findings really came from that. One is school meal participation consistently goes up. When they're free for everyone, you're going to have more kids who participate. We also found that many of the studies found that diet quality improves. Half of the studies showed improvements in academic performance and attendance. There was some evidence that it can improve household food security. And we also found no evidence of adverse BMI effects. That's something that's kind of percolated in some of the research, that, this fear that if you sort of just have it available for anyone and it's at no cost, that kids are going to overeat and it's going to negatively affect BMI. But the research really hasn't supported that. And then it solves a lot of problems. It solves the problem of unpaid meal balances. It reduces the stigma if everybody is eating the school meal, and it increases access for our children, so you don't have to worry about kids whose parents didn't fill out the forms or things like that. So 2020 and beyond. As I mentioned, those waivers came in spring 2020. They lasted through June 2022. And in the fall of 2022, many schools went back to that 3-tiered payment system instead of it being free for all children. This next bullet, I constantly have to update it because it's a moving target. But at the time I made this, my understanding was that 3 states had passed state laws, but I think more states may have. So Maine, California, and Colorado passed laws that permanently provide free meals. There are also another few states that passed policies that the meals will continue either for this past school year and possibly next school year. So Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, and Nevada all have free meals right now in this school year. Connecticut did it in kind of a crazy way where they allotted $30 million to do it, but then everybody ran out of money, and so they had a lot more money to get us through the end of the year. And it's right now there are bills to make this a permanent change in Connecticut, and I don't think that they have kind of made their way through the system yet. 20 other states have bills introduced, and I am part of a national team that's sort of studying the effect of this policy shift of looking at states where these changes have made and trying to match them up to control states to see how it affects food service, how it affects families, how it affects students. So I will conclude by saying that, I think schools really were one of the first battlegrounds in the policy effort to improve the food environment. It's clearly a place that you can reach so many children so, efficiently because they're all there. I think a lot of progress has been made. I think there's a lot of, from the USDA, the state level departments of education or agriculture that oversee these programs, as well as all of the food service directors and people working on the grounds, have done a remarkable job. I think tremendous progress has been made. There are, however, political agendas, as I sort of alluded to as I was working through, doing work in this area, that can really pose a risk to progress. And I really see our role as researchers to listen to those concerns, try to answer the questions the best we can with studies so that we can really inform policymakers about the best choices to make. And I'll just conclude by thanking everyone. I'll mention that we do have a monthly newsletter at the Rudd Center. We're on social media. This is our website, and I would love for us to stay in touch. Thank you.
Fantastic. Really great to hear about that all together in one presentation. So I've known about your work kind of in bits and pieces. So it's really nice to see it across the gamut and kind of how you got started.
Great.
So there's several questions for you here. I'm gonna start with one that I actually have a follow-up question to. So the healthy food certification research that you did showed increased intakes of school lunch and fruit options. So why do you think those policies aren't yet implemented on a national level?
So you mean the removal of the unhealthy competitive foods?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think states were kind of doing, we're doing it one at a time. I would argue that it kind of has been implemented at the national level through the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. So smart snacks, they're not identical to the Connecticut standards, which is why we still have our program, but they're very, very close. And so I do think that in many ways it has been implemented at a national level. I think the problem is that it's like a game of whack-a-mole with the food industry because, with the bbest year was the first year we did it because there was nothing on the market that fit the standard. So basically there was no ice cream, there was no cookies. They had, yogurt and fruit and things like that. But as the industry, as I mentioned, got better and better at reformulating and kind of meeting those standards, when you just look at what's sold in schools, it's kind of progressively looked less and less nutritious.
Yeah, that concerned me too, because the NASEM report that talked about what kind of snacks you should have, they really focused on whole foods and, for smart snack recommendations. But then when it got implemented, the food companies really got hold of it. So yeah, that was interesting. Michelle Smith just wanted me to remind you that Texas school nutrition policy was acted in August of 2004. And so one of the things we did was eliminate frying. So we were actually very progressive early on. Some of that hasn't maybe been carried forward as much, but anyway, just kind of.
No, I do remember that. I actually saw Susan Combs present at a national conference, and I agree. Texas did a lot of amazing things very early on.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question. Within the school environment, have you studied food, especially some of these foods outside of smart snacks that are sold by students to their peers? So they have their little businesses going on the side?
So I do remember when all this was happening, that's what people were saying was the kids were going to start these businesses out of their lockers. And part of me was sort of like, kids can't even remember their homework. They're really going to be able to like bring enough inventory in to keep a successful business going. So I'm a little skeptical as to how big of an issue this really is. I guess it's sort of a pick your battles situation. I feel like if there are students that are doing some of that, I don't know that there's you can try to intervene and discourage it. But it also, it feels like it would be a hard thing to really try to systematically change. And I'm not even sure that's where I would put all of my energy. So I'd be curious. I haven't seen any studies on how common that really is, as opposed to sort of just little anecdotes.
Yeah. So one question was about the prompts to take the fruits, so why was the verbal prompt to take fruit or juice and not to take vegetables?
Yeah, I know. I've gotten that question before. I think we wanted to go with what we thought was going to be easier at the time. And so I think we felt like the chances of them taking the fruit would be higher than taking the vegetable, just because kids tend to like fruit more than vegetables in elementary school. It would be great to redo that study with the vegetables and have a few different vegetable options and see what happens. But yeah, there's not really a great answer other than we were just wanted to test out the theory. And so we decided to go with what we thought would work best.
Yeah. So another question is, what would you see as the ideal lunchtime period? And I guess part of that depends on whether you have recess before or after, if you include recess as part of lunch. But is 30 minutes or 45 minutes? I mean, is there anything from the research that backs up it?
Yeah, it's, I think that I feel like 30 minutes, I feel like you're always balancing, right, with school districts. They have so many demands on their time and there's so many rules about how many minutes they need to spend doing different things. You can't just say, oh yeah, spending an hour sitting in the cafeteria enjoying your lunch. 30 minutes, I feel like is a reasonable amount. And I actually think this is being studied more. I don't know what the exact tipping point is. Some of it depends on how quickly kids can get through the line, how much time they actually have to sit down. So I think the more you can do to really maximize how much time kids have being seated, but I think certainly 30 minutes is a good realistic goal, I think, for schools to go for. And having it also be kind of lunchtime, because you also hear about 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. lunches. So really trying to do the best you can to have it at a time that really is between breakfast and dinner.
Yeah, I remember when we have worked in the elementary schools before, the kids would really complain because they weren't that hungry if you had the early lunch period, and then if you had the later lunch period, they needed a snack almost to carry them through.
Yeah.
So where does the funding for universal free school meals come from?
You mean in the states that have
Yes.
it? I mean, my understanding is it's in the state budget, so it's effectively coming from taxpayers. So I think each state, one of the things that'll be interesting now that this is getting implemented and things are a little more settled down after the sort of chaos of the last few years, to see how much it actually ends up costing. So of course the USDA and the federal government is providing some of those funds, but then those hit a limit. And so we'll figure out for each state how much it really costs. And then I think it'll be up to the states to decide how they will, cover those from other budgetary changes that they make.
Yeah, I know one of the policies that they were considering here is kind of an intermediate level where you cover the reduced price kids, so that they end up being free as well. So you kind of extend, but it's not necessarily everyone.
Right. I mean, I've heard over the years a lot of just criticism of that reduced price category because it just tends to not be very big. Like when you look at the numbers, it's this tiny little percentage compared to the other two categories. So it seems a little silly. Like, why not just collapse it and be done with it than having to complicate the administration by having a whole different category?
Yeah, yeah. I had a question here. How do shacks come into play to help in the selection of the district's policy? So here, there's school health advisory councils.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I feel like those are the groups that really make the decisions about what's going to be in a district policy. I know there's evidence that having those, so these are school level, right? The shacks? So having
No, they're district level.
Oh, they're district level. So certainly the district level committee, the more robust that committee is, I think the better everything is going to be in terms of A, having a really good policy, but B, really making sure it gets implemented and having that kind of buy-in that you need locally. I also think having, depending on the size of your district, having those school level teams can be super helpful too, because especially in a really big district, it can be very difficult to keep track of what's happening in every single school. And so I think having that sort of tiered approach where you then have these sort of school level teams has been shown. I know some research out of Maryland by Erin Hager has found that that really does help maximize the likelihood that things are getting implemented properly.
Yeah, we found that with if you had catch teams at the schools too. So they kind of serve that purpose.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting one. Are kids aware that school snacks are different, from the regular brands? And do they ever report preferring the school version?
That is such a good question. I have not seen a study on that, but I would hypothesize that no, they have absolutely no idea that it's different. I think, I'm thinking of a study that Tom Robinson did years and years ago where he put carrots in a McDonald's wrapper and the kids actually thought the carrots tasted better than the carrots that were not in the McDonald's wrapper, even though they were carrots. I think putting it in that branded package, I'd be very surprised if students felt like it tasted different than the branded product that they'd already had many, many times. But it would be really interesting to talk to students about this. We've published studies on this and we've raised this as a concern at the Rudd Center because we focus so much on food marketing to kids. And we've gotten some pushback, sort of like, what do you want them to do? They made them healthier. Like, why are you complaining? And I have tried to, ask, well, if they've made them, they reformulated, why can't they just change what they sell in the marketplace? But the problem is they'd have to all do it at once. Like this, we saw the same thing with kids cereals that, individually General Mills or Kellogg's or Post, they could, hear the criticisms in terms of the amount of sugar in the cereal, but it wasn't until they sort of worked together to set standards and felt like that wasn't going to give them a competitive disadvantage that I feel like we saw more movement in terms of the amount of sugar in cereals. So I think you might have to see kind of a similar process with snacks. But it'd be interesting to see if students can tell, B, if it upsets them when they find out what's happening, and then see if they actually prefer the healthier versions. That would be helpful to know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one of the big challenges we've seen are principals only having one lunch period for all kids, and it can be 1,000 kids at a time. And cafeteria can't serve everyone. So how do you convince principals to change this?
To change the number of lunch period?
Or to have staggered lunch periods, or are there any data that we can show, I think, is part of that question.
You mean that it works better because the students can get through the line faster and have more time to eat?
Yes.
I guess I think that would probably be the data would be just showing how little time the kids at the end of that line actually have to eat and the evidence that they're not eating as much. I mean, you could potentially do your own little study in your school where you sort of have the kids who are at the beginning of the line and show what they consume, and then the kids at the end of the line and show what they consume, and basically make an equity argument that this isn't fair, that some students are not getting access to the same nutrition because the lines are just simply too long.
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to go about it. Were you able to coordinate with the school dentist, or if there is one, in regards to oral health, especially with implementing eating more fruits and vegetables? That's one of the things we're interested in, is bringing in dentists and oral health hygiene for nutrition instead of focusing on obesity all the time. There's a lot of reasons to eat healthy foods.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. We didn't include them in sort of any of our studies, but certainly just from being in the field and sort of hearing from the different advocacy groups, I definitely think dentists are a huge asset and can make very compelling cases, you know, to school districts, to politicians as to why this is important. And sort of as part of the response, you know, to what you just said, I also feel like the focus exclusively on childhood obesity is not serving us as well right now. I think that in the beginning, you know, 20 years ago when we started all of this, the numbers were so alarming and the data were coming out showing this like steep rise in childhood obesity, and it felt like it made sense to really talk about it that way. One of the other things we study at the Red Center is weight stigma and weight discrimination and sort of stereotypes about people who are overweight. And so we've become very sensitive to just that messaging. And in fact, we changed the name of the Red Center from the Red Center for Food Policy and Obesity to the Red Center for Food Policy and Health, because we really felt like the obesity focus was distracting. And as you said, there are a lot of reasons to focus on nutrition quality and physical health that don't have to do with the number on the scale. And so I do think broadening that message, bringing in multiple partners and talking about it that way is definitely the way to make progress.
So I think that that's a great ending to the webinar. So we've run out of time. There are several good questions still on the list. So hopefully we can follow up with some of those later. But I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. We will be sending out a short evaluation. So if you have time, please fill it out. It really helps us to plan these. And as I said, this recording will be archived and it'll be at msdcenter.org, and you'll receive that link after the presentation as well. So in closing, I'd like to thank Dr. Schwartz for coming down here to give the presentation. We're so excited to have her here in Austin, and wishing y'all a great rest of today and rest of this week. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.